Hello again, welcome to this webinar on communicating as a family in times of crisis. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Isheeta Zalpuri. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and I'm also the associate director for the Pediatric Mood Disorders Clinic. This webinar is the second in a three-part series on positive parenting that is being hosted by our department. We are very grateful to our CME colleagues who have made sure that webinars such as this can be eligible for CME credit. Instructions on how to receive credit for this webinar are listed on the slide. During the COVID-19 crisis, focusing on the emotional health and well-being of our families is of the utmost importance. However, within weeks, the crisis has shifted family communication from a focus on short-term stressors to long-term fears and uncertainties. Communication in families is complex under usual circumstances, and crises such as this can enhance the intensity of interactions between family members. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Drs. Cosgrove and Starace, who are both child psychologists in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Nicole Starace is a clinical assistant professor and the director of psychotherapy in the Pediatric Mood Disorders Clinic. She is also a founding member and the assistant director of the Crisis Clinic. She has expertise in evidence-based strategies for enhancing communication and problem solving as a family and in crisis management. Dr. Victoria Cosgrove is a clinical associate professor and directs the Prevention and Intervention Lab. This lab is focused on studying stress and its involvement in the emergence of mood symptoms in adolescents, as well as developing clinical interventions that may help minimize negative responses to stress. She also directs the Family Clinic, which trains graduate students in psychology, as well as psychiatry fellows in the specifics of family therapy. They both will be offering practical advice on evidence-based communication and problem-solving strategies that facilitate positive communication within families. Our hope is that you will leave with affirmative family communication strategies and resources to mitigate family conflict, connect as a family, and build resiliency during critical times. We will be spending the first half of this webinar today on presentations, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Please use the chat button that's located at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And now I will turn the floor over to Drs. Starace and Cosgrove.
Thanks, Dr. Zalpuri. Next slide. So we're fortunate and excited today to be communicating with you about what we know as child psychologists around skills focused on communicating as a family in times of crisis. Next slide, please. So we're amidst an unforeseen time in our lives, and COVID-19 is something that 2 months ago, 3 months ago, none of us could have foreseen coming along our ways. And right now, you and your family may be asking yourselves, is this really a crisis for me? That's a question. I think that oftentimes when we're amidst a time of great change that we find ourselves asking regularly. And the overwhelming answer is yes, we are. Families are. We're amidst an unfolding global pandemic. Things change minute to minute, day to day, hour to hour. We're all receiving push notifications on our phones about things on a global and a national and a local level that impact every aspect of our lives. There has been overnight, in mid-March, there was a 360-degree shift to all family routines. So kids are suddenly home. They're all the time. And they waft in and out of all aspects of our lives. Family members are confused. There is great fear that goes up and waxes and wanes as as this global pandemic unfolds. And there's a tremendous amount of an uncertainty that I'll talk about a bit at the end, which is extremely unsettling. But you may be confused, especially in the Bay Area. Is this really a crisis? I'm still able often to get the food that I need. I may be able to work from home. I'm lucky enough right now to be working from home. Is this really a crisis for me? And it brings up the issue also of comparisons. I think this pandemic is a very interesting one because so many people are affected in very, very different ways. And there's a fair amount of comparison of suffering. And we know in our field that's not something that we encourage, but it's rampant right now. So in our world, pain is pain and stress is stress. And for example, if I see a child or a family in my offices, which I haven't done in a long time now, I do so virtually, I don't compare that pain. I know that pain is what that person is feeling right now. But in the Bay, we seem to have been somewhat successful at flattening the curve, and families may be asking themselves, what right do I have to be worried? I am worried. I feel fear. I feel confusion. But do I have a right to do so? These are very normal and very real feelings and concerns. Next slide. Suddenly, we've become very familiar with the term shelter in place, a term which I have not previously used in my language with any sort of frequency. And there's a lot of confusion and fear of sheltering in place as well. For families, I think that it's been especially confusing because we're getting a lot of mixed messages, right? Is this serendipitous family time? Should we all be doing puzzles? How many puzzles can we do in one weekend? How large should the puzzle be? Why are my kids not smiling when we're doing this puzzle? Why do they look stressed? Or is this a discrete space for enhanced levels of family conflict, right? Many of us live in very tight quarters, and the way we get around that in the Bay in particular is that we use the outdoors. And for more than a month, most of the outdoors has not been available to us either. And these are all situations that are very ripe for very high levels of conflict. Next slide, please. So this slide illustrates some of the common family stressors that families might be experiencing during COVID-19. And this is an abbreviated list. I'm sure your family could add their own situational stressors to this, but this is a pretty large list to have hit us all overnight. So the first, I have no space, is a big one. I have no space and I have nowhere to go. So we've all been encouraged. I joke that I've never seen so many dogs being walked over and over again. I didn't even know there were this many dogs in my neighborhood. They've never been walked before. And we have no privacy. Suddenly even as psychologists, right, well, often our work, we will prescribe to either kids or families, take space for yourself, right? Give yourself, go off to a park, go on a hike. And these things, again, have largely been unavailable to us. Again, wafting through all of these stressors, these very real, tangible stressors, is a tremendous amount of fear. A fear of what's to come, fear of what's already happened, and fear for our families, fear for our health. So there's I think a dual competing, and I have a subsequent slide on this that I'm going to talk about. Again, dichotomy or juxtaposition of folks feeling lucky almost to not be sick, if they are lucky to not be sick, and fear of being sick, fear for their loved ones. And again, I'll speak more on that in 1 minute. A very real stressor, I would imagine, for many folks on this webinar, may be that they are parents. And for parents of all learners, I have 4 children of my own, and overnight we were turned into distance learning instructors. And often extremely well-meaning teachers have launched imperfect, again, but well-meaning programs of learning that we feel pressure to carry out with our children. So on any given day, for example, my first grade teacher sends somewhere between 8 to 10 emails. They're adorable and well-meaning, and for me, they cause me great stress that I'm not delivering these messages, this learning. My daughter's somehow missing out. And of course, developmentally across the spectrum, it's very different when folks have young children, when folks have teenagers who are faced with not being able to take the ACT or the SAT, or not being able to graduate with their classes. All these things are leading to a great deal of grief. Economic discord is, of course, something that we have to mention. Very real. By the end of last week, it's unprecedented, the number of people who have filed for unemployment. People are losing jobs. And there is no end in sight to how this will unfold for families on a local level. Working from home with kids in the fray is another, again, sort of the juxtaposition of feeling lucky and wildly stressed at the same time at the disorganized chaos that exists often right next to work, but the pressures of work continuing. And I mentioned unemployment. Next slide, please. I did want to include a slide in our introduction about sickness and COVID-19 in families, and I mentioned this a little bit before. I do think there are, and Nicole, Dr. Starace is going to speak momentarily to some concrete ways that we can do this, but some of the questions around what types of communication may be coming up in families when I step back and think about the communication, A, that's going on in my own family, and B, that's going on in the families with whom I work. I think the question of how do I communicate with my children about COVID-19? How do I communicate with my children about a global pandemic is a pretty good question, and not one with an easy book that's been written. How do I talk to my children about masks? For example, suddenly, if my children and I go for a walk, folks are moving out of the way. How do I navigate those conversations? And sickness, which was previously something that families accept as a reality and have strategies to navigate around, and suddenly there's enormous amounts of fear that are around getting sick, feeling sick. What do I do? And enormous amounts of confusion. Our healthcare system has shifted also a lot in the last 8 weeks to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We hear very much about the end of the curve of folks that are extremely ill, but of course there are folks that all over the curve that are getting sick. So what do I say to my children if someone in our family does get sick? How do I talk about that? How do I communicate my own fear about COVID-19 with my children? And what do I say if a loved one is hospitalized? What do I say if a loved one dies? Where we exist, we live in California. People are dying here, but many of us have family in the East Coast where things have been rolled out very differently and have been harder hit. Next slide, please. So the biggest question, I think, is can my family survive this COVID-19 uncertainty? For many families, this is perhaps the largest overnight change that any family has undergone. And it's, again, filled with fear and confusion. The answer is absolutely. And our hope today is to provide you with some very basic skills that you can bring into your home, and that can serve as a base roadmap for how to move forward as this continues. So I will turn this over to Dr. Starace now, and I'll come back at the end before we switch to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cosgrove. Next slide, please. So in times like this, where there's lots of uncertainty and stress, focusing on our communication skills can really help to set a solid foundation and reduce stress in the family. The first skill that we're going to talk about today is expressing positive feelings, which can help set the stage for calm, supportive communications and lower conflict. The challenge with this one is that it's a little bit against our biology. Our brains were really designed to detect what's going wrong, not what's going well. And this has helped our species to survive. And during stressful times, we're particularly on the alert for what's going wrong. However, when it comes to caregiving, children and mammals in general learn best and connect more through reinforcement. So since this is a little bit against our biology, we have to remind ourselves to be on the lookout for what's going well in our child's behavior in order to motivate them and reduce tensions, which can set the stage for reduced conflict at home. When you do notice a positive behavior, be specific about what it was that you liked. So for example, I like how you washed your hands for 20 seconds, or thanks for putting your mask on right away, or I noticed how you've been working hard on your math assignments and I'm really proud of you. Sharing how their behavior made you feel can make it more reinforcing because it feels good to make loved ones feel good. You can say things like, I'm so proud of you for staying focused on your schoolwork while I was on a work call. Or, thanks for giving your sister a turn. It makes me so happy when you share. Or, I feel so loved when you give me hugs. Express your positive feelings non-verbally too by making eye contact or giving physical affection. You can give pats on the back, hugs, high fives, whatever it is that your child likes. Remember, you're the expert on your child and your family. Next slide, please. Expressing positive feelings is important across age ranges, but your style is going to vary depending on the developmental level of your child. With younger kids, you want to keep the language really simple and enthusiastic. Say things like, oh, thanks for listening right away, or it makes me so happy when you share, or yay, good gentle touches. As your kids get older, you can use more complex emotions and reduce the enthusiasm using a more calm and sincere tone. So you can say something like, I really appreciated how you helped your sister with her schoolwork. That made me feel proud and I bet she felt really supported. Thanks. Across age ranges, we also want to focus on the positives only. So only commenting on what you liked. Otherwise, these can turn negative or into backhanded compliments. So we want to avoid saying things like, good job on your math work. See, it wasn't so hard. Or, thanks for picking up your room. I wish you would always keep it so clean. Or, thanks for not grabbing this time. Instead, find the behavior that you did like and focus on that. So if your child doesn't grab, maybe say something like, thanks for asking first instead. Across age ranges, we also want to be genuine, both in our tone and in our words. So we want to avoid sarcasm. And we also want to avoid saying things like, thanks for playing so cooperatively with your brother as your child pushes his brother. As caregivers, it's inevitable that we're going to have negative interactions from time to time. We have to give instructions, we get frustrated, we're under a lot of stress right now, so that's natural, and we're gonna have to give negative feedback. And sometimes we feel badly afterwards. in addition to reminding yourself that you're only human, it can help to keep this 5-to-1 ratio in mind. It's kind of like all of our relationships have a bank account where our positive interactions are like deposits and negative interactions are like withdrawals. The challenge is that the deposits are a lot smaller than the withdrawals. So we need to have 5 deposits or 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction in order to keep our relationships balanced. So if you find yourself having some negative interactions and feeling bad, remember to be on the lookout for opportunities to have positive interactions. Next slide, please. Sometimes we do have to give constructive feedback. When we do, using I statements can increase the likelihood that our feedback will be heard and decreases the likelihood that we'll get a defensive response. You can start with saying how the specific behavior made you feel. These often start with I, which is why they're called I statements. A lot of times the emotion that comes up when we have to give negative feedback is our emotions like anger or frustration or annoyance, irritation. And while it's okay to use those, it can be more effective if we identify that softer underlying emotion, the secondary emotion, like disappointment, sadness, feelings of hurt or let down. After you state the emotion, then you can state the specific behavior that you didn't like, being careful to avoid criticisms and disparaging character statements. So avoiding things like you always, you never, you're such a. Instead, try something like, I felt disappointed when I saw you playing video games instead of doing your schoolwork. Or with younger children, you can say something like, it hurts mama when you hit. Although I statements can be used with younger children, they might not be as immediately effective, but they can help to build empathy and insight over time. Next slide, please. So what do we do when there are disagreements or conflicts? It's natural for us to want our opinion to be heard. And this is especially true for caregivers because our role is to instruct our children, especially now as many of us are homeschooling our children too. However, disagreements can escalate if your child doesn't think you understand their perspective. Active listening can help because it slows the conversation down and helps the other person feel heard, which can prevent disagreements from escalating. The strategies include first, paying attention. This one might sound obvious, but a lot of the times when there's a disagreement, we're formulating our response in our minds rather than giving our full attention. So when you're doing active listening, be sure to give your child your undivided attention. Then show your listening, both verbally and non-verbally. So you can do things like make eye contact, nod, say mm-hmm. Then ask clarifying questions to make sure that there's no misunderstandings. And when your child is done talking, summarize what you heard. This has 2 benefits. 1, it shows your child that you heard what they said. And 2, it gives them an opportunity to add any information that they forgot to add or that you left out. This can also be used across a wide range of ages. So with younger children, you really want to keep the language short and simple and consider their language abilities. With very young children, you might just parrot back what they said or describe what they're doing when they play. Next slide, please. I'm often asked how to respond when children are very distressed or when they're just distressed in general. When our kids are upset, we often want to make them feel better because it feels painful to us to see our children in distress, and we want to fix it for them. But sometimes this can backfire if we inadvertently invalidate their emotions or minimize their emotions. Making statements like, don't worry about it, or it's not a big deal, or it's just one test, are all said with the intent to reduce distress. But often this has the opposite result. Other times we jump in and try to fix it right away. Instead, try validating their feelings first. Some caregivers worry that validation might make their child more upset because it draws attention to the painful emotions that they're experiencing. But your child is already experiencing those painful emotions, whether or not you acknowledge them. And by acknowledging the painful emotions, it can help your child to process their feelings, de-escalate, and then also to connect with you, which can improve the relationship. So what is validation? Validation is communicating both verbally and non-verbally that you understand your child's perspective, that their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors make sense to you. This is not necessarily saying that you agree with their behavior. It's just saying that you understand their emotions given their context and their perspective. So how do you do it? First is to label the emotion that they're saying that they feel or that you think that they might be feeling. And then communicate both verbally and non-verbally that it makes sense and that you're taking them seriously. You can do this using eye contact and receptive, non-judgmental body language and tone. Verbally, you can say things like, "You feel sad and lonely that you don't get to play with your friends. That's really hard." Or, "I bet you're disappointed that your trip was canceled. I'd feel disappointed too." Or, "That email from your teacher saying your assignment is late is making you really frustrated. And that makes sense because you feel like you're working really hard and you don't know what else you can do." Then after you validated, then you can encourage problem solving or offer practical support. So you can say things like, "Would you like me to schedule a Zoom play date?" Or, "Even though it won't be exactly the same, I wonder if there's a way we can take the trip virtually." Or, "What are some ways I can support you with your schoolwork or this conflict with your teacher?" With young children, label their feelings with simple language. "You feel mad we can't play on the jungle gym." Or, "You miss grandma and are sad we can't see her. Me too." Afterwards, you can redirect. "Hey, look at this ball. How far can you kick it?" Or offer alternatives. "I'll ask grandma to FaceTime." With older kids and teens, continue to validate and offer support. You can include them in brainstorming solutions when they're ready, if that seems appropriate. If they're still upset when you try to move into problem solving, return to validation. So for example, let's say that you suggest having a nice family dinner where everyone dresses up because your child, your teenager is upset about prom being canceled. And they respond saying, "Oh, you don't get it, it's not the same." You can say something like, "You're right, it's not the same. It's so disappointing that prom is canceled. I'm really disappointed for you too." Before you say something like, "I'd really like to do something nice to commemorate this time, even though it won't be the same. Let's think of some ideas together when you're ready." Next slide, please. When conflicts come up repeatedly or the family's facing a big challenge, you can problem solve together. Usually what happens when there's a problem is we think of a solution, judge immediately if it's good or bad, and decide if that solution is good to use it. And then if we think it's not good, then we think of another one till we find one that we like. That's faster, but it also cuts the creative process short and leaves us with no backup plan. So what we can do instead is use this acronym STEPS with 2 Ps to remember an effective strategy to problem solve together. The first step is S, say the problem. In this step, we want to identify the problem and use active listening because a lot of times people have different perspectives on what the problem is. Sometimes it might even turn out that what you initially thought was one problem is actually several problems. The next step is T, think of solutions. In this step, we brainstorm a variety of ideas without judging if they're good or bad. This helps to boost creativity when we put the evaluations on hold. Sometimes, depending on the child, I'll even suggest a solution I know might be bad just for humor, to demonstrate that I'm not judging, and to get those creative juices flowing. Then after you're done problems or brainstorming, then we move into E, evaluate. Here's where we discuss the pros and cons of each of those solutions that you came up with. And you can consider both the short and long-term consequences. The next step is P, pick. In this step, we pick the ones that work best for the family. A lot of times I'll have everyone give a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a thumbs in the middle. Sorry about that. The second P is plan. And this is a step that, that oftentimes we miss, but is particularly important because otherwise we can lose track of implementing the plan. So in this step, we figure out who's going to do what and what do we need in order to carry out the plan. And finally, the last step is S, see if it works. Use the plan. If it doesn't work, then you can return to P and try again. And if it did work, great, problem is solved. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Cosgrove to wrap up the presentation portion of the webinar. All right, thanks, Dr. Cosgrove.
Thanks. Beautiful presentation, Dr. Starace. And you have a great way of presenting things in a very tangible way that I think people can really understand and hear. So by no means are we saying any of this is going to be easy or is easy and probably has been unfolding as easy in your life. So I think to close again the presentation part, we want to validate the idea that we should all be expecting bumps in the road every single day, if not every single hour, truly. So the slide is organized around the central idea that we know to be true, which is communication is very powerful. And what we're trying to do today is to empower you as a family to communicate in ways that we know can be the most helpful to your to mitigate your own emotion that may be negative at times. But let's be honest, right? Uncertainty, the literature is very clear. Uncertainty is incredibly unsettling, and there is simply no way around that right now. And normal is gone, right? Where'd it go? It's every single thing is different, including the way the Amazon packages are dropped off at the door. But even under normal circumstances, even under outside of a global pandemic, flawless family communication is simply unattainable. And I think I've worked with so many families, and I'm human myself, that strive for flawlessness. And it simply is unattainable. And so relaxing some of those expectations now under a time of enormous stress and duress is imperative right now. So communication is powerful. The thing that helps is checking in often. So checking in often with those with whom you are communicating, what's working and what's not working. So your own family will have and does have its own style of how you both communicate and how you check in. Now is the time to do that with even more frequency and more deliberateness, if you will. And finally, I do think this is a time when families in particular on a microcosmic level need to believe in their own strength and their resilience. Even with all of these skills, this is still a terrifically terrifying time that is again filled with a great deal of uncertainty. Next slide. So we've our department has put together a very built out, and we keep on adding to it, resources page for folks. This slide does a good job at giving an overview. So if you access the top link, the webinar recordings are going to be captured. Folks can listen to them at their own leisure. Last week, colleagues did a webinar on talking to young people about, actually it was positive parenting. Next week is talking to young people about COVID-19, I think. There are three. The Pediatric Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Clinic has developed a beautiful handout, and resources continue to be developed on an ongoing basis. We have been spearheading connect and recharge groups, and Dr. Starace has been leading them. Do you want to maybe just say a word or two about them? You're mute. Oh, there you go.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, so in order to support the well-being of all of our colleagues who've been affected by additional stressors that are happening right now with COVID-19, we're providing stress check-in opportunities through these connect and recharge groups. And there's a number of people who are involved in these. Dr. Kaysen is heading these through the department. And these groups are free and confidential, and they're open to all members of the Stanford medicine community, including faculty, trainees, and staff in the School of Medicine, at Stanford Healthcare, and in Stanford Children's Health, or LPCH. In addition, there are some groups with special topics, and we're doing one on positive parenting. I'm leading some of those along with some of the other colleagues that are involved in this webinar series. So we hope that you'll be able to join us. And if you'd like some additional support around parenting during this challenging time, please check out these connect and recharge groups.
Thanks. That's perfect. And the following 8 resources also offer truly amazing support. Our department and the medical school broadly among them. So we encourage you to access these as you see fit. So I'll turn it, I think, back over to Dr. Zalpuri at this point. We have, it looks like, about 20 minutes left for some question and answer back and forth that Dr. Starace and I are excited to participate in a virtual way. So.
Yeah, thank you both for keeping it real. You both have a wealth of knowledge and experience. I'm so glad we got to listen to you. And I really enjoyed the specific examples that pertain to the current climate, very valuable. So that was great. We've received some great questions. So the first question is, and I do want to remind people to please use the chat button that's located on your screen to submit these questions. The first question is, how would you recommend personally addressing the pressure to feel lucky to not be sick, which I think Dr. Cosgrove, you had alluded to during your presentation, with our families and especially with friends and others that really push this perspective?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to respond to that. I think I brought that up because I do feel like that is something that right out of the gates, especially in the Bay, I noticed to be a real pressure that people feel, and it's in conflict with, sorry, I'm shifting around. It's in conflict with our heightened stress and strain and emotion. I think to dovetail into the skill sets that Dr. Starace talked about, many of the skills of communicating with others also work to communicate with ourselves. So sort of validating that feeling is a very, that pressure, and acknowledging that it's different people are experiencing different things right now. There are some similarities. I think we are encouraged by broad scale media, and we're obviously even organizing it to some extent in this webinar to be focused on the similarities across. But this is a very different type of crisis for different groups of individuals and families, by and large. And so acknowledging and validating that pressure that you feel, but allowing yourself and your family enough room to feel what you feel. With regard to the second part of that question is back to sort of the social comparison nature of this, which I think is not unique, but it's certainly very not unique to stressors. We do a lot of social comparisons, but it's certainly very, very heightened here. So again, I go back to pain is pain, and a family can feel its pain in its own way, and that's okay. That's in fact what we would encourage, and it may be uncomfortable. So validating a family or a friend's viewpoint, and also acknowledging that yours is different, is good, a good thing. Go ahead, Dr. Zalpuri.
All right, thank you for sharing that. And it looks like someone asked about the Connect and Recharge groups and whether they are appropriate for older teens or only Stanford professionals. And I see Dr. Starace already responded that it is appropriate only for Stanford professionals. Another question here is, my son rolls his eyes and walks away when I express positive feelings. Should I stop doing it since he doesn't seem to like it?
Yeah, I'll take that one. That's a really great question. And first off, I want to say, like, really good job continuing to reach out and try to connect with your son, even when he's giving you those negative responses, because that can be really hard when we're getting that negative feedback to keep going. So I want to encourage you to keep trying and try not to take those negative responses personally. Sometimes teenagers will do that especially. So there's a few things that you can do. First, maybe consider your style and seeing how it fits with your child. Maybe tone down enthusiasm if that might help, or seeing if there's another way that you can find to connect with him. Sometimes if kids aren't used to hearing positive feedback, which this may or may not be what's going on in this situation, but sometimes if they're not used to it, they might respond negatively at first. And so if you keep trying, they'll get used to hearing more positive feedback and they'll start to respond more positively too. And sometimes, especially with teens, I might use a small written note at first instead of telling them face to face, especially if you're having a tough time personally dealing with those negative reactions. Dr. Cosgrove, is there anything else you would want to add?
No, I think that covers it. I think it's tricky though, right? So that and it's again very painful sometimes to when our children aren't expressing positive feelings towards us. So yeah. I think that's a great answer.
And something along similar lines, how do you talk with a teenager who doesn't open up? I see stress in his behavior, but he says he's fine and doesn't respond.
I can take that. That's also a great question. I think this time in particular, I've been thinking a lot about teenagers and how they're, again, back to the point of the uniqueness of everyone's stress. We know teenagers are incredibly social human beings by nature, and that's developmentally what should be happening. And we're suddenly relegating them to social isolation on computers, which, for the record, is often what parents are trying to get their kids off of screens a majority of the time. And now we're saying this is actually the only way. So I think this is uniquely painful in ways that we may, as older individuals, as adults, as parents who are fearful for our kids, not always acknowledge in the right way. So in particular, teenagers not opening up, this is a perfect time to use validation. So talking about how this is a uniquely tough time for you. This is got to be excruciating, that you were used to spending 6 hours a day doing homework or playing soccer with your friends or communicating on all sorts of apps, which you can still do. And now you're home with your little brother, you're home with me, you're home with your father, you're home with someone, grandma, and you're not leaving. So I think the validation piece has got to be a key, and acknowledging the differences between their being socially isolated and older, or those of us whose social lives maybe weren't so vibrant outside of this to start, is a really important thing, and not minimizing that, because that's it's very painful. The grief piece too, I think, for teenagers, I mean for all of us, but the folks have talked about this to some extent in the popular media, but there's a real grief and loss at not being able to mark milestones in the same way. And the idea, I think, in many local settings is to postpone milestones or to mark them in different ways. All of those are good ideas and will help mitigate again, but they're acknowledging and validating the grief that there is no senior prom. The senior prom is no longer, or there is no graduation that oftentimes teenagers look forward to and parents look forward to for their whole lives. And so this is a truly unique experience that is teenagers are allowed to grieve.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was really helpful. Another question we got was, when teens get frustrated or furious with unsolvable conflicts, like with a teacher or someone in authority who does not agree with them or with their way of dealing with certain situation, how can parents calm them?
So I think the first step, if your child is very angry about a situation, is to return to that validation piece. And maybe if you're not really understanding why they're angry, maybe start with active listening to understand their perspective and what's going on. And then once you understand it, then providing validation, saying, yes, it's very frustrating that this thing is going on, or yes, it makes sense that you would feel angry about it. You're not validating the behavior, and you're not validating that or saying that the teacher is wrong in any way, because it sounds like in this situation, the teachers might be dealing with it correctly. But you still can validate the frustration and the anger that your child is feeling because of that. And so that's the first piece to do. And then once they've calmed down, then you can maybe ask them, well, what do you think you'd like to do about it? And see if you can get their ideas to see if they have any solutions that might be helpful. And then you can walk them through how they can respond to their teacher in a way that might be helpful. And some of it might be just sitting with that anger and tolerating that anger that they feel and moving through that until they come to a place of acceptance. Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Cosgrove?
Yeah, I think that's exactly how I would have answered it as well.
It's not always jumping into solving the problem. And then we have a question about a 5-year-old. My 5-year-old's immediate reaction when I asked him to do school activities or physical work and get off and leave screens behind is to scream or have a meltdown. How can I convince him that there are other things we need to do besides screens? Mm-hmm. Cosgrove, did you want to take that one?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very again, this is very tricky situations, right? Because whatever one's individual family's rules around screens have been they're probably out the window at this at this point if it looks anything like my home. And school is all on a screen, so suddenly there's an encouragement. The very first thing that comes to mind is just the developmental spectrum, right? A 5-year-old, there's expectations and an ability to focus that a teenager might be able to have that a 5-year-old's probably not going to be able to have. And your family also has to be able to function with minimizing meltdowns and tantrums, right? So because that's disruptive and chaotic and causes, I would imagine, great duress for your other family members. So it's a balancing act of, what is realistic. And I think that's why I brought up earlier the again, different school systems are different public versus private, and how the resources they've had to roll these types of things out. But some of it is unrealistic for 5-year-olds, and you as a parent right now, again, it puts more pressure on you to make your own judgment. But some of it, I would say to let go, if it may not be worth having the tantrum and the meltdown for your own sanity. So the short answer is normal's gone, right? And so your family, back to the idea of checking in over and over again about what today, what has worked, and how should we shift this moving forward around screens, around did this work or did it not? Dr. Starace, any other thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I think the main emphasis here is on surviving and, keeping your family as healthy and happy as possible. And, I know sometimes we're worried about our children falling behind in school or their coursework, but everyone's in this situation. Everyone is also going through this, and not all of the kids in the class, a lot of the kids in the class might be also not doing schoolwork and things like that. So keeping that in mind and letting go some of that pressure on yourself to fill all of those roles, all of those hats that you're being asked to fill, can be helpful.
Yeah, and now shifting gears a little bit, we have a question about an older teen. How do we communicate with our older teens when they very persuasively argue that they should be able to bounce between our home and also their shelter-in-place home of their boyfriend or girlfriend's home, just like their best friend is bouncing between his divorced parents' homes who are sheltering in place? We don't have any reason why they shouldn't, other than that's what the rules are. The 18-year-old is headed for pre-law studies and can argue circles around us and turns our positive communication validations back on us.
Yeah. This is a really tough one. And, I think it's even harder because maybe your teen also has friends whose parents are allowing them to see their significant other. And so that can make it even more tricky because it's confusing to teens that their friend can do it and why can't they? And it sounds like your teen thinks that if he argues long and hard enough, he'll wear you down enough that you'll give in on this. And so what I'd suggest is you can say is try to not engage in that conversation. I would first validate, though, again, like you said, that he's turning around the positive communications and validations. I would just stick to something short at this point. It sounds like he knows your perspective, and maybe say something like, I know this is really hard. I know you really want to see your girlfriend. It's a huge loss that you can't see your girlfriend, and it's really tough right now. And I'm sorry that we can't allow you to see your girlfriend. And then leave it at that. And if he wants to engage in the argument, you can tell him, I don't think it's not a decision anymore. There's not going to be any change in my decision. And so you're wasting your breath with arguing, and I'm not going to engage in it anymore because it's just going to lead to more conflict. And I want you to know I care about you, and I'm really sorry that this situation is going on because it's really hard. And leave it at that as much as you can. Dr. Cosgrove, anything that you would add?
No, it's challenging because, again, it goes back to the individual differences and how folks are also responding to, or families are responding to social distancing and the unique choices that we're making. And we're seeing some of that of course, play out on a national level. And I think your family is allowed to make its own rules, and you're allowed to change them as time goes on. But to Dr. Starace's point, just sticking with it. And I hear you about the arguing circles around you. It looks like it's going to be a long haul with pre-law. I'm not encouraging that for any of my children.
And, I think this is one which a lot of us can relate to. My partner and I are not on the same page when it comes to parenting. What do I do?
It's a big question.
Yeah, so this is a really tough situation, and definitely not uncommon, because we all have different backgrounds. We're all raised in different ways, and sometimes this translates into different parenting ideas. And so although the skills that we talked about today, we talked about them in the context of parenting, these skills can also be used with adults. And so they can be used with your friends, your parents, your colleagues, and your partners. So when you have these sort of challenges where you guys you have different perspectives, it can really help to use the active listening and the validation to understand your partner's perspective and make sure that your partner feels heard. And then you can potentially use problem solving in order to find some practical ways to align your values. Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Cosgrove?
This is something, again, outside of global pandemics, and the work I do with families, and I would say is one of the biggest tenets of what we focus on, right, is getting folks aligned on a parenting level. So it's not unusual right now that with all of these new stressors that are coming up to be on different pages, working through as much as you can and getting some collaboration and as close together as you can is the goal. Again, that's we're very flawed as communicators, and we're especially when we're under such great duress, and that's likely to continue. So but it's a big lifelong struggle that parents have. It's very much.
Yeah, thank you both. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to take one last question. Can we forward the recording to patients and family friends? And the answer is that once it is posted on the CME website, you can share it because it will be publicly available. I just want to thank Dr. Starace and Dr. Cosgrove today for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us. And a big thank you for all of you out there who took time out of your busy schedules to join us and ask some really terrific questions that apply to a lot of the families. This webinar will be posted by the CME department in the next couple of days on their COVID-19 education website. I'm just going to post this in the chat as well, and you will be getting an email from us with the link for the webinar. You can also find a link to the webinar that was hosted last week on that website on positive parenting during shelter in place. And don't forget to tune in for our last and final webinar in this series on adapting to change, maintaining structure, and keeping families healthy, which is scheduled on Thursday, May 14th at 11 a.m. Thank you.